This is the map of my northern Italian trip. I made 12 stops before ending it in Firenze. My route took me first to the fantastic La Palazzetta del Vescovo, the bishop's little palace, then to Assisi, and finally to Orvieto with its famous Duomo. Massimo, my driver, and I started from Roma on the first leg of my northern Italian trip, stopping in Umbria at what was at that time a soon-to-be-finished luxurious place to stay, as it were en famille, where you too can indulge yourself to your heart's content. When we got to La Palazzetta del Vescovo, it wasn't finished, so we had to use our imagination as to what it would look like. The view is obviously great. But you don't have to use your imagination. It's here and now. Wow! Wow! I could move in, couldn't you? Well, you can. On arriving, Massimo was full. The bathrooms weren't even finished. Devo cambiare l'acqua alla olive. He had to shed a tear for Nelson. Muss austanken. He had to get directions. The view is really breathtaking. And though the relay is modern, it's historically correct. They rubberized the main Palazzetta, rebuilding it using the same stonework while modernizing the inside. The smaller building next to it is the Zocchi's residence, the owners. This is what the front and the side look like today. Coming in the main building, you immediately get that atmosphere, Stimmung, that warm, cozy family feeling with the exposed rafters and elegant fireplace mantel. It lets you know you're in the charming, caring hands of your hosts, Paola and Stefano. Eating can be a very informal affair, yet the ingredients are bought fresh from the local farms with lightly drizzled extra virgin olive oil and a dash of balsamico vinegar. Or formal for those special occasions like birthdays, weddings, or anniversaries. They even have a special room for workshops, small seminars, or corporate meetings. We went upstairs to see how far they'd come in finishing off the various bedrooms and suites. You'll notice that this suite has lots of electrical outlets, and the bathroom is very modern. Now, this is what they look like today. I do take a little credit because Paola and Stefano asked my advice on what the room should contain. I said, whatever the number of electrical outlets you have in mind, double them. And second, make the shower big enough for a sexy two. Lo and behold, they did. We moved on to the next suite. This one was very hard to imagine how it would turn out. However, Paola and Stefano have accomplished the impossible. If you look very carefully, you might catch a glimpse of the resurrected ghost of a time past that haunts this suite. Be sure to ask them about it when you stay there. Here are two examples of the standard luxurious bedrooms, a four-poster, and one more my style, an open room with a flat-panel TV. Quite apart from the outdoor activities and the usual indoor activities, you can indulge yourself in aromatherapy and a relaxing massage en suite. When you're planning your trip to Italy, this is a must-stay place. Just these two views alone are enough to convince me. You can check all this out on their website, www.lapalazzettadelvescovo.com. I couldn't leave without one final view from the second floor. Imagine what it's like now with everything completed. It's time to take a short drive to Assisi, the center of pilgrimages to St. Francis and the art treasures inside the Duomo. Take it away, Massimo. Despite Assisi's location and massively imposing structure, I have a problem with it. Massimo drove me there with a bad attitude. It was that this was going to be a highly commercialized shrine with the Franciscans with outstretched arms begging alms at all opportunities. It was, of course, a self-fulfilling prophecy. We approached Assisi from a slightly different angle, and it's still impressive. Driving through this narrow gate, you can imagine in the dark ages of St. Francis, guards controlling all who desired entry. At the west end of this hilltop city is the Duomo, the Piazza delle Logge, and the Friary complex. It is situated on land given by Simone di Pucciarello. At the time, it was known as the Hill of Hell. It was there that criminals were put to death. Now, because of the uncorrupted body of St. Francis, buried in the Duomo, a preserved body is the sign of sanctity. It is called the Hill of Paradise. The Piazza delle Logge, or the Lodgers' Square, is surrounded by colonnades constructed in 1474. They housed pilgrims flocking to this basilica. This complex was started immediately after St. Francis was canonized in 1228. It was designed by Brother Elia Bombardone, one of his first followers. When finished in 1253, it combines Romanesque, French Gothic artwork and establishing many of the typical characteristics of Italian Gothic architecture. What you see were only a fraction of the visitors that were there that day. Right behind me was a long line of souvenir stalls, and inside the basilica, several Franciscans, all they were doing was shushing the people. It was a three-ring circus. I should have hired a guide, as it is one big fresco after another, largely the jottings of Giotto. The lower church, if lit properly, would look like this, but the lighting is nowhere near this bright. Ergo, a lot of the important frescoes were dim at best. So I'll have to show you what they should have looked like. Before Giotto, there was Cimabue, 1240 to 1302, who still hung on to the stylized, busy Byzantine style. He was more or less the last painter of the medieval period. It lacks perspective, it has wooden figures, gray complexions, and lots of gold. Though the colors have faded now, this is his most famous work, Our Lady Enthroned with St. Francis. It was done about 1280. I'm toying with you. I'm not showing you Giotto yet, as his best work is in the upper church. Here is a pupil of his, almost anonymous, just called Maestro dei Livelli, Master of the Vaults. These 4 lunettes are dedicated to St. Francis and those 3 knots on the white cord that they wear around their waist. Starting at the bottom, this first one is the glory of St. Francis surrounded by angels and saints. If you look closely, you'll see he's bug-eyed. Maybe he has a malfunctioning thyroid gland. You know it as goiter, gorzo, or kropf. Now at the top, the first knot is the allegory of poverty. In the center, Christ marries St. Francis to poverty, a winged, gaunt woman in rags. In front, a child throws stones at poverty. On the left are the followers, on the right those who scorn. And at the top, all of St. Francis's worldly goods borne by angels toward heaven. The second knot, the allegory of obedience. Obedience in the center sits between 2-faced prudence on the left, the faces of the past and the present, and humility on the right. Obedience is putting a collar of obedience around a kneeling monk's neck, while Providence holds out a mirror, symbolizing knowledge to the kneeling monk. St. Francis, on the roof, is watching. He already has his yoke, and that's not funny. The third knot, chastity. She rules from a well-fortified castle. Only angels may enter To reach the castle, you must follow a long path up the hill. On the left, a layman and a Franciscan reach the top. On the right, the women, the poor Clares, do so as well. In the center, all are washed by angels. To the far right, the boar's-headed uncleanliness, the burning head of ardor, love with his clawed feet and heart strung around his body. In the upper left, the spider-legged death. I still have a bad attitude about Assisi, and in particular the Italian shushing Franciscans. The reason is simple. They wouldn't allow photos of any kind. Stupidi! Why don't they do what they do at the Zwinger Museum in Dresden? You want to take photos? It costs an extra €5, though no flash is allowed. You know, they might even make money at it. It's just another example of Italian chaos that has even permeated the church. That's taking the vow of poverty over the top. This upper church is Gothic, tall and slender, and lit by large stained glass windows either side of the nave. Now let's look at some wonderful frescoes by Cimabue, and finally, the Jottings of Giotto! The west transept and apse have several frescoes by Cimabue. This first one is the Apocalyptic Christ. The second, the Crucifixion with St. Francis at the foot of the cross. Finally, one I didn't see, and you will only see 20% of it. It's St. Matthew, and it was this fresco that fell down in the earthquake of 1997. Cimabue didn't know the right technique for lasting frescoes. He used lead oxide in his colors and almost hardened plaster instead of fresh. Moreover, damp and decay had further deteriorated them. They are now almost photographic negatives. Giotto di Bordone, born in 1266 near Florence to a peasant family. He was the shepherd of his father's flock. It was Cimabue who discovered him, though the how is much in dispute. In spite of the fact that he was short and ugly, he was a great wit and practical joker. He was married, had 6 kids, saved his money, and died a rich man. In Florence, he was given the title of Magnus Magister, Grand Master, and was appointed city architect and superintendent of public works. He designed the famous Campanile, but died in 1337 before it was finished. The fresco you see is of St. Paul. Notice the shading of color, blue, and the face with the beginnings of an expression of emotion and the absence of total facial gray, the faint hint of ruddiness. He is considered the herald of the Renaissance. St. Francis was a very literal man. He decided that in order to serve God, he must embrace poverty. So in the town square, he, as a rich man's son, took off all his clothes and wore a rough wool habit. In the fresco, his father holding his son's clothes looks real pissed, and judging from St. Francis's skin tone, they sure didn't go in for suntanning in those days. Pope Innocent III granted him the right to form the Franciscans. On his death, in 1215, and early into the pontificate of Honorius III, you see him preaching to the Pope, who is listening very attentively. The others are not so focused. Here again, the more realistic presentation and texture is beginning to show up. The most famous story about St. Francis, the Sermon to the Birds. The saint, accompanied by Brother Maceo, came upon a flock of birds that listened to his exhortation to praise God with their song. They stay attentive to the word of God until he has given them a blessing. You can see this in the close-up of his right hand with the 3 fingers extended, representing the Trinity. The black silhouette around both his hands draw attention to them. Francis giving his mantle to a poor man. One of the first signs of Francis, prior to becoming a mendicant, migrating towards poverty. Still a rich man's son, giving his golden mantle to a poor man. The background is apropos. High on a hill, the worldly city on the left. He and his horse moving to the right, with the monastery high up in the background. St. Francis and the Sultan at the Crusades. St. Francis, full of religious ardor, crosses from the Christian lines to those of Islam, hoping to convert them. Here he challenges the Sultan to a trial by fire. He and the Islamic mullahs will walk through the fire as a test of the true faith. The mullahs are slinking away while the Sultan sits powerless. Yes, I know you didn't know. It was St. Francis that started the tradition of the nativity scene. He was but a deacon at this Christmas Mass in Greccio, a little hilltop town southwest of Assisi, probably a good 2 weeks' walk away over the mountains. He had a crib constructed and took a sleeping child from the congregation, awakened it, and placed it in the crib. From that time on, all early nativity scenes were live tableaus. Frankly, I was glad to leave the Duomo and the Italian Franciscan insanity. These guys can't hold a candle to the ones I've known at the Casa de Paz y Bien in Paradise Valley, Arizona. Especially Father Alonso de Blas, the Friar Tuck ×2, in height, and Father Gino Piccoli, the latter the only priest I've ever known who said Mass off the top of his head differently every day, save for the consecration. You notice at the top of the hill is the Rocca Maggiore, the bloody big rock. Actually, it's the ruins of a castle dating back to the times of Charlemagne. Swinging the camera around in the opposite direction is the fertile valley of Umbria, surrounding the hilltop fortress and the religious shrines of St. Francis and St. Clare. I'm about ready to haul ass out of town, and with it, a change in attitude. Straight ahead is the city proper, and as you can see, all the souvenir shops as close to the Duomo as possible. Yeah, I stopped and got a souvenir hat pin. I collect them. It's my sort of passport to show where I've been. Though just thinking about this experience brings back all the negative images and feelings. You know the difference between a Franciscan priest and a friar? About $2 a pound. It's off to Orvieto, a very special Duomo. You'll see why in short order. It's one of the outstanding Renaissance Duomos in all of Italy.